Sir, I'm afraid you've made a mistake. This is the entrance to the West Point Annual Officers Gala. I think the VFW hall you're looking for is across town. The voice was young, sharp, and dripping with a condescending certainty that could only be forged in the crucible of 24 months of service and a freshly minted commission. Lieutenant Robert Miller stood ramrod straight, his own dress uniform a perfect symphony of pressed fabric, gleaming brass, and precisely placed ribbons. He and his two colleagues, Lieutenants Davies and Cho, formed an immaculate barrier of youthful authority before the Academy's grand archway. The man they were blocking was the antithesis of their polished perfection. He was old, perhaps 80, with a face like a worn leather map and eyes that held a quiet, distant stillness. But it was his uniform that drew their open derision. It was an old army green, a style phased out decades ago. The fabric was faded to a soft, indistinct olive, the shoulders slightly stooped where the man's frame had settled with age. It was clean but undeniably worn, the threads thin around the collar and cuffs. A single, sparse row of ribbons sat above the left pocket, their colors muted by time, almost unrecognizable. Miller gestured vaguely at the old man's attire with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Seriously, Grandpa, where did you even get that thing? A surplus store? It's a pretty good costume, I'll give you that. But the party's inside, Davies snickered, a sound like tearing paper. Check out the ribbon rack. Is that even a real combination? Looks like something from a movie. Cho, ever the sycophant, chimed in. And the fit is all wrong. Regulation states the jacket hem must align with the top of the hip pocket. That thing's hanging like a coat. The old man didn't react to their taunts. He simply stood there, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, his posture relaxed, yet possessing an unshakable core of dignity. He met Lieutenant Miller's gaze without malice or anger. "My name is Samuel Hastings," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, like stones tumbling in a slow river. "I was invited." Miller's smirk widened. He took a step closer, invading the old man's personal space, his own chest puffed out with the unearned confidence of his rank. "Invited by who? The Historical Reenactment Society? Look, I'm in charge of access tonight, and your name is not on any list I have. We have congressmen, senators, and active duty generals attending. We can't just let anyone wander in off the street wearing a Halloween costume." He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Just do us all a favor and move along before I have to call the MPs. It would be embarrassing for everyone." Samuel Hastings didn't move. His gaze remained fixed on the young lieutenant's eyes. "I assure you, Lieutenant, I belong here." The quiet certainty in his tone, the complete lack of defensive anger, seemed to irritate Miller even more. It was as if the old man was immune to his authority, a concept the young officer found intolerable. The confrontation was beginning to draw a small crowd. Elegantly dressed officers and their partners paused on their way into the gala, their curiosity piqued by the scene. They saw 3 pristine young lieutenants and 1 out-of-place old man. The optics were clear, and their sympathies, if they had any, were with the institution, with the sharp-looking young men upholding its standards. The injustice of the moment hung in the cool evening air, invisible to all but the man at its center, who seemed to carry its weight with an ease born of long practice. The lieutenant's patience, thin as it was, finally snapped. "That's it. I've had enough of this. ID." Now his voice had a new, harder edge. Samuel Hastings slowly reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and produced a simple, laminated military ID card. It was old, the photo showing a much younger man with the same steady eyes, but the details were clear. Miller snatched it from his hand. He stared at it, a frown creasing his brow. "Sergeant Major Samuel Hastings," he read aloud, his tone laced with disbelief. He scoffed, handing the card back as if it were contaminated. "A non-com. Well, that explains it. Sergeant Major, you of all people should know the rules about unauthorized wear of the uniform. This thing you have on is a disgrace. It's a mockery of everything we stand for." He began to circle Samuel, like a predator inspecting its prey, pointing out perceived flaws to his audience of 2 and the growing number of onlookers. "Look at this," he said, tapping a finger on the faded sleeve. "The material is all wrong. And these patches, I've never seen this unit insignia in my life. It's probably something he made up." He then gestured to the small, faded ribbon rack. And this is the real joke. Let's see, what do we have here? He squinted theatrically. A purple heart, a bronze star. Okay, believable enough, I suppose. But what's this one on top? The blue one with the stars? That, my friends, is the Medal of Honor. A wave of murmurs went through the small crowd. Davies and Cho now looked openly contemptuous. Stolen valor was the ultimate sin. So that's your game. Miller sneered, his voice dripping with venom. You're one of those. A fraud. You come here, dressed in this pathetic costume, wearing a medal you didn't earn, hoping to get a few free drinks and some sympathy. It's pathetic. Samuel Hastings remained silent, his expression unreadable. He had weathered storms far worse than this tempest in a teacup. He had faced down men whose words were backed by bullets, not just unearned arrogance. The insults washed over him, leaving no mark. He simply met Miller's furious gaze and held it, a silent challenge that the lieutenant was too blind to understand. I'm giving you one last chance to walk away, Miller commanded, his face now flushed with anger. Take off that jacket and get out of here. If I see you again, I'll have you arrested and charged. We take stolen valor very seriously here. He stood directly in front of the old soldier, his taller frame casting a shadow over him. It was a tableau of modern military pride versus antiquated, forgotten history. The onlookers shifted, some looking uncomfortable, others nodding in agreement with the lieutenant. It was a matter of standards, of protecting the honor of the uniform. They didn't see an old man being humiliated. They saw a potential fraud being exposed. The dignity of the institution was paramount. The air crackled with the unresolved tension. Samuel didn't flinch, didn't speak. He just stood his ground, alone, weathered rock against which the waves of youthful ignorance crashed and broke. He was waiting. He had learned, long ago, that the loudest voices were often the first to be silenced by the truth. Just as Lieutenant Miller opened his mouth to escalate the situation further, perhaps to physically remove the old man, the smooth hum of an approaching vehicle cut through the tension. A black, flag-bearing sedan glided to a halt at the curb. The young officers immediately recognized the four-star flag on the fender and straightened up, their demeanor shifting instantly from playground bullies to disciplined soldiers. A driver in a crisp Class A uniform hurried to open the rear passenger door. Lieutenant Miller snapped a salute, his eyes fixed forward, eager to impress the arriving dignitary. Out of the car stepped General Marcus Wallace, a man whose reputation was as immaculate as his uniform. He was the keynote speaker for the evening, a decorated combat veteran of 3 wars, and the current Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. He was a living legend in his own right, a figure of immense authority and universal respect. He returned Miller's salute with a curt nod, his eyes sweeping over the scene. He took in the 3 rigid lieutenants, the small crowd of onlookers, and the quiet old man in the faded green uniform. His gaze, sharp and analytical, stopped and locked onto Samuel Hastings. The general's entire posture changed. The formal stiffness of a senior officer melted away, replaced by something else entirely, a look of profound, unadulterated shock, which quickly morphed into something akin to reverence. He ignored Lieutenant Miller completely. He ignored the salutes of the other officers. He walked directly towards Samuel Hastings, his polished shoes clicking on the stone walkway. The crowd watched, utterly bewildered. Miller held his salute, his arm beginning to tremble, confusion warring with rigid protocol. The general stopped a single pace in front of Samuel. For a moment, the 2 men just looked at each other, the 4-star general in his perfectly tailored blues and the old Sergeant Major in his worn-out greens. An entire generation of military history stood between them. Then, General Wallace did something that stunned every single person present. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height. His back went ramrod straight. With a precision that was breathtaking to behold, he brought his right hand up in the sharpest, most powerful salute of his 40-year career. The snap of his gloved hand hitting the brim of his cap echoed in the dead silence that had fallen over the courtyard. He didn't just salute. He held it, his arm locked, his eyes boring into Samuel's with an expression of the deepest respect a soldier can offer another. Time seemed to freeze. Lieutenants Miller, Davies, and Cho stood like statues, their own salutes forgotten, their mouths slightly agape. A 4-star general was saluting a man they had just accused of being a fraud. The world had turned upside down. After a long, pregnant moment, General Wallace lowered his hand but did not relax his posture. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon the still-frozen Lieutenant Miller. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute command. "Lieutenant," he said, the word cutting through the air like a shard of ice. "Do you have any earthly idea who this man is?" Lieutenant Miller's face, which had been flushed with indignant rage just moments before, was now a ghostly white. He couldn't form words. His throat was tight, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and a rapidly dawning, sickening horror. He could only shake his head mutely. General Wallace's eyes were like chips of granite. "I didn't think so," he said, his voice dangerously low. He turned back to Samuel Hastings. "Sergeant Major Hastings. It is an honor, sir. I apologize for the conduct of my officers. Their ignorance is a failure of my leadership, and I will rectify it." Samuel finally offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "They're young, General. They only know the new army." "That is an explanation, Sergeant Major," Wallace countered, his gaze sweeping back to the three terrified lieutenants. "It is not an excuse." He took a step closer to them, and they visibly flinched. "You stand here in your perfect uniforms, so proud of your regulations and your rulebooks. You think you know what a soldier looks like. You know nothing." He pointed a finger, not at Samuel's chest, but at his faded uniform. "This uniform, this man, they are living history. You mocked his ribbons. Let me educate you. You see that bronze star? He earned it on a recon mission so deep in enemy territory that your grandfather hadn't even enlisted yet. You see that Purple Heart? He has 3 of them. One for shrapnel, one for a bullet, and one for a knife wound he got in a fight so close he could feel his enemy's last breath on his face." The crowd was now utterly captivated, leaning in to hear every word. The general's voice rose, filled with a passion and fury that was terrifying to behold. "You questioned his unit patch, a patch you'd never seen. Of course you've never seen it. He was a member of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG, a unit so secret that for 30 years, the government denied its existence. These men went places no one else would go and did things no one else could do. They were ghosts. They fought a shadow war while men like me were still learning how to navigate with a map and compass." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Miller looked like he was going to be physically sick. The general wasn't finished. He gestured to the top ribbon on Samuel's chest, the pale blue, star-spangled ribbon they had ridiculed. "And this you called a joke." His voice dropped to a reverent whisper. "This is the Medal of Honor. It was awarded to him by President Johnson in a ceremony so secret that only 5 people were in the room. The citation is still classified to this day. But I'll tell you what I can. On a moonless night in 1968, Sergeant Major Hastings, then a staff sergeant, single-handedly held off an entire enemy battalion that had overrun his fire base. He was wounded 3 times, but he moved from position to position, gathering ammunition from the fallen, calling in airstrikes on his own location, and saving the lives of the only 2 other survivors. He was found the next morning, unconscious, under a pile of enemy dead, still clutching his rifle. The general's eyes were now glistening. "So you see, Lieutenant, this man is not a fraud. He is a giant. His faded uniform has seen more hell than your entire generation of soldiers will ever know. The dust on his boots was collected on battlefields that don't exist on any map you'll ever see. You are not fit to polish his medals, let alone stand here and question his honor." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, incongruous sound of music from inside the gala. Lieutenant Miller's entire world had been dismantled in the space of 5 minutes. The rigid certainty, the arrogant pride, the very foundation of his identity as an officer had been shattered. He looked at Samuel Hastings, really looked at him for the first time, and he didn't see an old man in a costume. He saw the hero the general had described. He saw the quiet strength in those old eyes, not as weakness, but as the profound calm that comes only after surviving the storm. He saw the stooped shoulders not as a sign of age, but as a frame that had carried burdens he couldn't possibly imagine. Shame, hot and acidic, rose in his throat. He felt smaller and more insignificant than he had ever felt in his life. His polished uniform suddenly felt like a cheap costume, a hollow shell signifying nothing. Davies and Cho were equally devastated, their faces pale masks of horror and regret. They avoided looking at Miller, at the general, at anyone. They stared at the ground as if hoping it would swallow them whole. It was Samuel Hastings who finally broke the spell. His gravelly voice was gentle, devoid of any triumph or recrimination. He placed a hand on General Wallace's arm. "Marcus, that's enough. The boy made a mistake. A big one, but a mistake nonetheless." He then turned his steady gaze on Lieutenant Miller. The young man flinched, expecting a final, crushing blow of condemnation. Instead, the old soldier's eyes held a surprising softness, a flicker of something that looked like understanding. "Your uniform is a symbol of a promise you have made to this country, son," Samuel said, his voice even. "Mine is a record of a promise I kept. You were taught to see the symbol. You have not yet learned to see the man inside it. There is a difference between regulations and respect. Regulations build soldiers. Respect builds leaders." The simple, profound wisdom of his words struck Miller harder than any reprimand could have. This man, whom he had belittled and humiliated, was now offering him a lesson, a chance at redemption. It was an act of grace so profound that it brought tears to Miller's eyes. He finally found his voice, though it was choked and broken. "Sergeant Major. Sir, I am so sorry. I have no excuse. My conduct was unforgivable." General Wallace stepped forward, his expression still stern, but the fire in his eyes had cooled slightly. He addressed the three lieutenants. "Your apologies are noted, but they are insufficient. Your real apology will be in your actions from this day forward." He turned to Miller. "You will personally escort Sergeant Major Hastings into this gala. You will seat him at my table as my personal guest of honor. You will ensure he wants for nothing for the entire evening. After that, you and Lieutenants Davies and Cho will report to my office at 0600 on Monday morning. We are going to have a very long conversation about history, humility, and the true meaning of honor. Your careers are not over, but they are now on a very short leash, and your redemption is something you will have to earn every single day for the rest of your service. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." The three of them snapped in unison, their voices filled with a new, desperate sincerity. General Wallace gave a final, respectful nod to Samuel. "Enjoy the evening, Sam." "It's good to see you," Samuel offered a rare, small smile. "You too, Marcus." And with that, the four-star general turned and strode into the gala. The crowd of onlookers, humbled and awestruck, parted for him like the Red Sea. Lieutenant Robert Miller, his face still streaked with tears of shame, turned to Sergeant Major Hastings. He stood at attention, his posture no longer arrogant, but deferential. "Sergeant Major Hastings," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "May I please escort you inside?" Samuel Hastings looked at the broken young man before him and nodded slowly. "Lead the way, Lieutenant." As the unlikely trio, the humbled young officer and his two chastened colleagues flanking the quiet old hero, walked toward the grand entrance, the symbolism was lost on no one. The crisp, new uniforms seemed to bow in deference to the faded, storied one between them. They were no longer a barrier of authority, but a guard of honor. For Lieutenant Miller, the night was no longer about glamour or prestige. It was the first day of the rest of his education, a lesson delivered not in a classroom at West Point, but on a stone walkway by a quiet old man who wore his heroism as lightly as he wore his faded green jacket. He had learned that true strength wasn't in the sharpness of a crease or the shine on a boot, but in the quiet dignity of a promise kept.